Hey class, this is Chris. This week we're going to be talking about the rule of life exercise that you will have attached to your final paper. And I think we have some of our discussion threads and some of the work this week will be centered around that as well. So I wanted to spend just a little bit of time for this week's video to talk about the rule of life exercise. So first I'm going to just give you a little bit of a look at the way I approach my own rule of life. I think it's important for us not to overthink a rule of life. The rule of life comes from essentially Benedictine orders where monks would create a way of living their life together and a way of living their life with God. And Christians in the modern world now use the concept of a rule of life to create an articulatable, expressible pattern of living their life with God. And so I don't want you to overthink this. We all have a tendency to make things more complicated than we should. And so for me, a rule of life should be memorable. It should be intuitive. It should actually speak to how you're wired and what animates you. Like, for instance, in my rule of life, a part of my rule involves creative or intellectual pursuit, and that's not going to be necessarily true for everyone. So you got to know how you're wired. And in that sense, I think sometimes it's helpful to get feedback from a trusted person in your life as you create a rule, because they can help you make sure that you're tailoring a way of living your life with God that actually makes sense, that fits your personality style. So really want to caution you, don't overthink it. Really what I'm hoping for in your rule that you attach to your final paper is just a simple bullet point kind of category way of saying, here's how I'm tending to my own life with God. So I would say that a rule of life should probably involve 4 big categories: your mind, your body, your soul or your heart before God, and your relationships. So I'm going to give you some broad categories, and then I'm going to get down into actually what my rule of life looks like so that you can see what mine's like. I would encourage you, don't just copy and paste. You can actually take some of what we talk about here, but I want you to think about it. Don't just sort of say, yeah, that's good. Let's go with Chris's. So one of the things that I think helps us with a rule of life, especially engaging the different seasons, if you're thinking of mind, body, soul, and relationships, is to think about an aspect under each category where you want to nourish yourself and then where you want to challenge yourself. If a rule of life is all challenge, like it's all a list of things that you're not currently doing that you want to do, like I'm going to get up at 5 a.m. and exercise 5 days a week, too much challenge is actually going to push you out of activity and you're going to stop doing it. So I want to encourage you to have a blend of what's nourishing my soul and then what is going to challenge me. What am I doing already? Like I, for instance, love to read fiction. So that's good. That's easy for me to do. But I need to do some other things that are going to challenge parts of my life with God. So thinking of in terms of what's nourishing to me and then where am I going to need to be challenged or pushed out of my comfort zone. So here's my rule of life. It's actually very simple. I'm going to list off the components of my rule. Number 1, devotion and worship. That's the way that I tend to my soul before God. And then learning and fostering curiosity. That's how I tend to my mind, my relationships. And then Sabbath rest for me, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes because that was a late addition to my rule of life. And then physical exercise. So I've got devotion, I've got learning, I've got relationships, I've got rest, and then I've got physical exercise. So my rule of life is a 5-component way of me living my life with God. So I'm going to just unpack these 5 things so that you can hear kind of how I came to the conclusions that I came to. I came up with the concept of needing a rule of life when I was in a graduate program many years ago, but I didn't create a workable rule. It just didn't work. I was way too complicated with things. It was not this simple. It's my conviction that a rule of life ought to really be something you could write on the back of a napkin to someone and say, here's how I live my life with God. So mine was way complicated, required a spreadsheet, ultimately not helpful because I wasn't actually living it. What I want you to do is actually live this thing. So mine, I distilled it down to these 5 things because I don't need to refer to a spreadsheet to tell you this is how I live my life with God. These are the things that I pay attention to, the big categories. And you'll find, and I'm sure you've already discovered this because we talked about it with our last paper, categories, discernible categories actually mean a lot to me because they help us get clear about what we really care about. So, for instance, in your final paper, I want you to delineate your paper around categories, around values or things that you've heard in the reading and that you're working on experientially. Your rule of life is the same thing. I want you to think about the big sort of buckets of your life and then think about how can I tend to and be intentional about these buckets. So for me, first, devotion and worship. So under that, I think of my own corporate worship and I think of my personal worship. So there are two subcategories under. My corporate worship is I go to church. I'm at church. I would be at church even if I wasn't the pastor of a church because I need to be in Christian community. I need to worship. I need to receive the sacraments. And so for me, corporate worship is being a part of church life, sacramental worship, being a participant, not just a preacher. It's really important. I'm making sure I don't get locked in my building with the alarm set. Sorry about that. So for me, my devotion and worship is both corporate, but it's also private. So my private life, so public life is going to church. My private life with God is every single morning without fail. I sit and read the Bible quietly before my kids wake up, before my day starts. I start my day with the Lord. So currently right now I'm reading through the Bible in a year. My wife and I have the same plan. We read separately and then we sometimes come together and talk about that. So I begin my day with devotion. I don't read for sermon in the morning. That's different. That's study. This is devotion. And so for me, I tend to my private life with God through prayer, through reflective reading. I do the prayer of examine. I do Lectio when I read the Bible. We're going to talk about those over the next couple of weeks in our live session. And so for me, devotion and worship is very important. I listen to worship music. I give myself space on walks or runs or at the gym to listen to playlists and to engage in musical worship. Musical worship helps me tap into emotion in my life with God. And so that's a big, big, big part of my life is word, prayer, worship. Those things are big in my own devotional life with God. So that's the first category, devotion and worship. The second one for me, and this one's really unique to me in the sense of how I'm wired, I believe it's really important for me if I'm going to be fully alive. I want to foster curiosity through intellectual pursuit. I am energized by intellectual pursuit. I like being around smart people. I like listening to podcasts where people are saying things that are challenging to me, whether they're Christian or not. I just love to learn. It's a part of how I'm wired. I realize that I am more deeply animated by God when I am in spaces where I am being challenged to think deeply and learn. It's one of the reasons why I pursued doctoral studies. I really don't care about letters past my name. That has never animated me. Money doesn't motivate me a great deal. Being in pursuit of ideas, that motivates me. So I tend to that. I read nonfiction. I listen to podcasts. I'm always reading fiction and nonfiction. I feel like it's just a part of my rule of life. And so in this sense, I hesitate to tell people, well, what I do, you should do, because we're not all wired the same. It's not uncommon for me to have 3 to 5 books going at all the time. And so I'm able to juggle those ideas. I'm always reading fiction. I'm always reading nonfiction together. So some theology, historical biography, like right now, for instance, I'm reading Larry McMurtry's Lonesome Dove because that spurs curiosity, beauty. It's a cowboy story, not inherently Christian. I'm also reading Richard Rohr's book, Adam Returns, which is a book about male initiation. Such a great book. I'm also reading The River of Doubt, which is a biography of Theodore Roosevelt going down the Amazon River with his kid after a failed presidency run. So those are very divergent books, some theological, some just that make me feel like I'm interested. I also listen to podcasts, so I feed that curiosity. A couple of my favorite podcasts, The Art of Manliness, I love. You don't have to be a dude to like that podcast. A lot of good thinking, a lot of good stuff there for men and women. My wife actually also loves that podcast. I also love Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, Emotionally Healthy Leadership with Pete Scazzero. That's probably my go-to right now. He's a wise man. He's a pastor in New York. Just very clear, very compelling. He challenges me. He's almost like a pastor in my life just because I listen to his podcast. It's very conversational, super simple, kind of like we're doing right now. Another one I love that I think has been almost a game changer for me is John Mark Comer and Mark Sayers' podcast, This Cultural Moment. I've devoured that one. It's about theology, about God, about the church, about a desire for revival. I found myself weeping as I've listened to episodes of this podcast. John Mark Comer is a pastor in Portland, and Mark Sayers is a pastor in Australia, and they are just killing this. They are talking about the move of God, just such a powerful analysis of culture, post-Christendom, but also this need for God to come in. One of the last episodes I heard on that one was this idea that the next move of God is going to be a blend of form and fire. The form, you think of John Wesley's bands and class system. It was a very organized structure. Benedictine spirituality was very organized. It had a form. And then you think of the revivals of Whitefield, the Hebridean revival. There was a lot of fire there where the Holy Spirit was coming. And they believe that the next move of God is going to be a blend of both form, so structure, and fire, the animating power of the Spirit. And that just speaks to me. I need to hear people say stuff like that. I don't want to be the creative ceiling of my own life. So I'm always reading. I'm always listening because I really want to be challenged. I believe iron sharpening iron. Another voice would be Ruth Haley Barton. Her podcast is Strengthening the Soul of Your Leadership is amazing. If you're a pastor, then I would say for you guys, we need to listen to women. We need to find female voices in the church that we can receive from and submit to. Our sisters in this class have had to. You're actually forced to listen to guys because in the evangelical world, it seems like most of us are dudes that are doing the talking. So one of the parts of my rule of life is I find females nurturing my own devotional life and my own curiosity. They can teach me. And so I submit to those teachings. And Ruth Haley Barton is a trusted, wise voice. And she really speaks to me in fostering my own learning and my own curiosity. So devotion, curiosity, that's two of mine. The third one would be relationships. I know this about myself, that I need to force myself into vulnerable and transparent relationships. If I don't, then I'll cultivate an image that isn't entirely dishonest, but it's also not entirely honest. And so for me, my rule of life involves honest and vulnerable conversations with trusted people. So my wife is one of those. My closest friend, Marty Reardon, who's our worship pastor, is one of those. I have another friend named Ben, who is one of those, who is just a lay person in our church, but is actually a great friend to my wife and myself. So relationships are very important for me. I have to actually make choices about transparency. I also submit to the leadership of people in authority over me. That's a healthy form of relationship. My bishop, Todd Hunter, and TJ Johnston, I tell them how I'm doing. I give them insight into my heart, my soul. Those men challenge me and encourage me. They speak life to me. And then finally, I have my relationship with my kids. I tend to my daughters. I've got a daughter in college, another one that's about to start school, about to start college, and then a son who's a freshman in high school. And I have to pursue those young people and be in a relationship with them. And so I force myself out of myself. One of the things that I've learned about being a pastor is that if you're not careful, you can kind of turn inward in your own mind and be weary with relationships. And so I pursue strategic relationships in my life. Fourthly, Sabbath, rest. For me, Sabbath was not a part of my rule of life for the longest time. I actually felt like I wasn't wired as a contemplative. I was like, Sabbath's not that important for me, until I kind of hit the wall. I think I alluded to this early in our class. I had probably my equivalent of some sort of a panic attack probably 8 or 9 years ago. And God used that to show me that I was living beyond the pale. I was going beyond sustainable limits. And because of that, I've had to make commitments to unplug. Yet yesterday was a Sabbath day, working my rear end off on these other days. And so when Saturday comes, it's just a gift to be with my family, to go outside, to watch basketball, like just to stop. Scazzero says about Sabbath, we stop, we rest, we contemplate, we delight. Stop, rest, contemplate, delight. You don't have to spend your day in church. If you're a pastor, I would recommend that your Sabbath not be on Sunday because you're working on Sunday. So whatever helps you stop, rest, delight, and contemplate, that's Sabbath. And finally, for me, physical exercise has been a huge thing. And I think this is an under-tended to portion of our own spirituality in the evangelical church. We have a lot of very unhealthy pastors and leaders. And so for me, exercise is a way to not only reduce stress, but it's a way to tend to my body as a temple of the Holy Spirit. So in my rule of life, I list under each of those categories the ways that I pursue health in those areas. You might do it differently. You could actually just use mind, body, soul, and relationships. And you could name, where am I nourishing an existing thing that already gives me life, and where am I going to challenge myself in this season? And that can change season after season. What I really want from all of us is a commitment to look at how we want to live our life with God. Because I found that when I articulate, I'm going to go to church and I'm going to be in the Word of God every single day, then I know that I've made a commitment to the Lord, and the people around me know that I've made these commitments. And so one of the great things about my rule of life is that if I stop living an aspect of my rule, the people close to me notice and they ask me about it. They're like, Chris, I've noticed you haven't been exercising lately. Or, Chris, I haven't heard you mention any kind of books that you're reading. Are you underwater? And it helps me recognize that there are times where I do get underwater. And when one of those aspects of my rule begins to evaporate or diminish, when you articulate a rule, then it gives you the grace to go, wait a minute, what's going on that's causing me to squeeze out the core commitments of my life? Essentially, what I want you to do is to name how you're tending to your life with God. And that should always involve some form of devotion and worship. But it also should involve your physical body, an aspect of your heart and relationships. And so I want you under those categories to think about how to name the things that you're asking God to actually help you live into. And it can be simple. You don't have to make this complicated. I would actually say, please don't make it complicated. So to recap, mind, body, soul, relationships. And under soul, I would say we're talking about devotion. We're talking about your life with God. And then I would say if you want to have a nourish category and a challenge category, then you can name under nourish things you're already doing or you naturally do that you want to keep doing. And then under challenge, there may be a thing under each category that you would say, I really want to challenge myself here. But I want to encourage you, don't swing for the fences. Don't try to do too much. Don't try to do more than you should. A rule should be simple. It should be intuitive. It should be something that actually enhances your way of being with God. And finally, once you submit this, once you do the work, which you have to with your final paper, I would encourage you to share your rule of life with someone or someones who know you, someone who cares enough about you. Like for me, it would be sharing that with my wife or my closest friends and saying, does this look like it makes sense? And they may say, well, you're missing something, or that's a little strenuous, or you're not challenging yourself enough. Sometimes having someone look in on this will actually make it not just be an assignment, but it'll actually make it something that's meaningful for your life with God. So let's work on a rule of life. When we engage in our next live session, I'm going to ask you guys if you have any questions about it, but I really don't want you to overthink it. I want you just to come up with a way of saying, here's how I would take care of my whole person. And your whole person is going to be slightly different than my whole person. But there may be some of what I've said tonight specific to my own rule of life that will be helpful for you. I haven't actually got into all the details of like what we do and how I talk about certain things with friends, because I actually don't want to fill in all the gaps for you. I want you to do a little bit of work to think about in your own life, how are you going to tend to certain things. So that's rule of life. Let's sit with it and see whether we come up with something really good. And when your final paper's due, you're going to submit this as an attachment in addition to that paper. And I look forward to reading what you've got. And if you have any questions, again, please don't hesitate to reach out and ask. God bless. I'll see you when I see you. Thanks. Bye.